So I want to thank everyone for taking that moment. And I know sometimes moments of silence can feel awkward, they can feel uncomfortable. But I think that's the point of them, that we have to sit in that uncomfortability, right? Thinking about those lives that were lost, right? How uncomfortable that is. So I just wanted to take that moment for that. And thank you all for taking that with me. So this is my agenda for today. I'm going to talk about my positionality, and you might have heard a bit of it in the keynote. We're going to talk about who are the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And I know that seems really basic, but I feel like sometimes folks actually don't know the differences, the intersectionalities of indigeneity. We're going to talk about colonization and its effects. We're going to ask the question, am I a settler? And I feel like that one is a really hard one for a lot of racialized folks, right? What does it mean to be on these lands? And then we're going to talk about how you can be in solidarity with indigenous people. And I know sometimes when I'm doing workshops, folks are like, why aren't we just starting at the how can I be in solidarity? And for me, it's really because we have to get through all of that other stuff before you can even think about being in solidarity, right? And oftentimes when we think about solidarity work, folks are just like, how do I show up? I just want to be there. I want to be in the space, right? But they're not taking the time to do that work prior. And oftentimes some really uncomfortable things happen when we don't do that work, right? So my positionality, who am I? What work have I done? What does this mean to me? Well, I'm an Indigenous person, an Afro-Indigenous person. So Indigenous solidarity is pretty important. Kind of need it to survive. And that's part of the reason why it's important for me, but it's past that, right? What does it mean even for me as an Indigenous person to be in solidarity with other Indigenous people? Because it looks different for all of us. What works for me as a Métis Anishinaabe person might not work for someone who's Mi'kmaq or Inuk or a Coast Salish, right? I really have to think about what does it mean for me to show up, not just for my community, but other Indigenous communities every single day. And part of that looks like doing this work. Now, when I talk about what work have I done, this is always like an awkward thing for me. I feel like even with my bio, I was like, I write. I'm not good at the whole, like, these are the laundry list of things that I've done. But the things that I have done is I spent 10 years in the education system working around creating space for Indigenous learners with different organizations. So I originally started out with at the time, the Aboriginal Education Center in Toronto. It's now the Urban Indigenous Education Center. But that's really where I had someone believe in me for the first time. I was put on this committee. I was the youngest member of it. And that's really what got me swinging in the work of activism around access to education for Indigenous learners. I remember sitting there at that committee and they were telling me that they were cutting the funding for Indigenous youth to get up to Eastview Public School, which is a school in Scarborough, to learn Anishinaabemowin, the Anishinaabe language. And at the time I was really angry because I didn't get access to that. And so to hear that they were going to cut this for other Indigenous learners was really upsetting for me. And so that's how I got into this work. And so when I got to post-secondary, anyone here do the student movement? Was anyone a part of the student movement in post-secondary? Yeah, it was a time to be alive. In the student movement is really where I stuck my foot in it, around creating space in post-secondary. And so a lot of my work was around educating non-Indigenous people about the things that Indigenous folks were facing when trying to access post-secondary. Like many people don't know, if you're Inuk and you live in Nunavut and you come down to the south for school, if you do not return over the summer, you will not get funding for your education for the next year. So Inuit learners have to go back. Now, part of that is to retain Indigenous folks in the north, right? To allow Inuit to be in their homelands. But also, part of that is a restriction of access to education, right? We understand there's not as many resources in the north. And so Inuit end up coming south to work, but they have to return, right? So what does that mean for Inuit learners? A lot of folks don't know that there's about 15,000 Indigenous learners waiting to access funding for education that are still waiting to access the PSSSP, which is the funding for Indigenous learners, right? So that was a lot of my work, educating folks around that. So when I'm talking about Indigenous solidarity, right, it looks like many different things. For me, it was creating space. It was educating, right? For others, it might be attending cultural camps. It might be giving up space for other people to access, right? It looks different for everybody, but that's the work that I've done. So enough about me, we're gonna get into it. So who are the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island? I'm sure we all know First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, right? Indigenous people in Canada are not a monolith. They're not pan-indigenous. And it's important to acknowledge that distinction, right? That we have 3 distinct groups. And even within those groups, there are more distinctions, right? Again, I said Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq, Salish, right? So many different communities, even within First Nations. Even within Métis, there's different communities, right? Some people talk about the little M versus big M. That's a whole other conversation I'm not going to get into, right? And then even Inuit that have a huge homeland, right? Across not only Canada, what we now call Canada, but the US and Greenland. And they have distinct dialects, distinct cultural practices. So First Nation folks are defined as Indian under the Indian Acts. I don't recommend calling a First Nation person an Indian. Now, some might refer to themselves in those ways. You might hear the term Indian taco. It's totally fine to say it, also extremely delicious. I recommend it. But Indian's not the term that we use anymore. First Nations was actually first used in the 70s and 80s. That's where we first heard the term. And that was during the National Indian Brotherhood. So before we got to the Assembly of First Nations. That was the first organization that existed. And they started using that term as a way to acknowledge their relationship to these lands. Now, First Nation folks have treaties with the Crown. It's not to say that other Indigenous communities don't have treaties. Sorry, my translation thing is sliding down my back. It's not to say that other nations or other communities don't have treaties. Inuit have modern day treaties. But they specifically have treaties that exist prior to colonization, right? Treaties are the building blocks of Canada. And First Nation folks have reserves. Now, I'll never forget the time I was hanging out in a park with friends and police officers showed up because they wanted to kick us out of this park. And they asked for my ID. And at the time, all I had on me was my Métis identification card. And they asked me, why was I off my reserve? Now, one, it's anti-Indigenous, it's racist, but also a misconception. Métis folks don't have reserves, right? So even though people might know that there's a distinction amongst Indigenous people, it's important to acknowledge our relationship to land looks different. We then have Métis, and it's mixed with First Nation and European. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who's born tomorrow, whose father is Cree and mother is French, is automatically Métis. That's not how it works. Métis people are a distinct community, nation, that have existed on these lands for hundreds of years, and specifically prior to colonization. And now you might say, well, aren't they just mixed? Yep, hand it back.
Hello. As defined by Dr. Heather Devine, who is a Métis scholar and historian, Métis people are French men who married First Nations women. That's the start of Métis people. Therefore, those who are mixed are mixed. We have to be careful and respectful to those who identify as original Métis people. From the teaching from one of my mentors. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And yes, there's many different understandings of Métis, and I thank you for sharing that. And Métis people were created through that relationship of a First Nations person and a settler, what we call settlers now, right? That's where we get it from. But again, right now, like you said, people who are born today, who happen to be Cree and French are mixed, right? It's important to acknowledge that historical community and how it came to exist. Like I said, some people might say, well, they're just mixed, right? It's important to acknowledge the reason why Métis are Métis people is because they went through ethnogenesis. Does anyone know what that term means? So ethnogenesis refers to a period of time, 100 years, where a distinct community, culture, language, and customs is formed. And that's how you have Métis people. And it specifically happened prior to colonization, or colonization more so in the West. So that's why you have large Métis communities in the prairies. The term Métis was legally defined in 2003 during the Paoli case. And for folks who might not know what the Paoli case is, it refers to a father and son who were hunting, and they were charged with illegally hunting. And they had asserted as Métis people that they had a right to hunt on their traditional lands. They went to the Supreme Court and therefore defined Métis. Métis people also have settlements and road allowances versus reserves. Now, the only settlements that currently exist are in Alberta, and I'll get to that a little bit later. We then have Inuits. And again, they are indigenous peoples of Northern Alaska, Arctic Canada, and Greenland. Their homeland spreads. Again, oftentimes when we think of indigeneity, it's very much stuck in borders, right? Even within communities here, the Anishinaabe Nation is a huge nation that spreads into the United States. In places like Illinois, that oftentimes people don't think of, where my partner lives in Illinois, is actually the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people, which are Anishinaabe people, right? But when I moved there, that wasn't my first thought. I didn't even know that my community was this far south, because it's very central southern Illinois, right? So Inuit spread across. Now they have modern treaties and land claim agreements. So can anyone name a modern Inuit land claim treaty? Yes? Absolutely. Another one? Anyone? Nunavut. Nunavut was a modern treaty and land claim, right? Anyone who was in school prior to 1999 didn't have to remember Nunavut or Iqaluit as the capital of Nunavut, right? Because it didn't exist as a territory yet. Inuit also, and this is something that I learned from having an Inuk roommate, Inuit just means people. So when you say Inuit people, you're saying people, and Inuk sometimes get a little laugh out of that. The plural term for Inuit is Inuit, singular is Inuk. And the Inuit homeland, Inuit Nunangut, has 4 regions. So we already heard Nunatsiavut. We have Nunavut, Nunavut, and Iqaluit. And it's important to acknowledge that these homelands spread across. Again, sometimes when we think of homelands, we think them as super small and regional, right? We don't think of them as spreading across large places, oftentimes divided by other nations, right? When we think of the Inuit population in Labrador, what does that mean for the Inuit population in the Northwest Territories or Alaska or Greenland? So these are distinct communities with distinct cultures and languages and customs. So we're going to start to talk about colonization. Now that we know who the indigenous people are, we're going to get into colonization and its effects. So colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous peoples of an area. And I want to emphasize that colonization has not and is not only happening in North America. Colonization is happening globally. From here in Canada to Kenya in the African continent, to Jamaica in the Caribbean, right? To China with the Uyghur community. It's happening everywhere. So when we're talking about colonization, we have to think about the way it affects us globally, right? And the way it affects indigenous people. And when we're talking about indigenous people here in North America, right? And we think about the ways in which colonization has affected them. Lack of access to clean drinking water, lack of access to adequate healthcare, lack of access to education, right? And it's interesting, I was having a conversation with my partner and I was like, indigenous people in North America can't claim refugee status anywhere in the world because we're in a first world country, despite the fact of the way in which we're being treated, the way in which we don't get access to resources. An indigenous person couldn't go to Germany and say, I would like refugee status as an indigenous person. right? That is also an effect of colonization and the way in which we look at Indigenous people from particular places and their access to resources and whether or not they are deserving of more help. Colonization is also the act of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use. Ottawa is unsurrendered Algonquin territory, right? This was an appropriation of this land. That is colonization. Again, there being very few Algonquin people here today. That is colonization, right? As an appropriation of space. So this is a short, limited timeline of colonization on these lands. I want to say this obviously doesn't cover absolutely everything that has happened and is still happening. But colonization really started in 1534 when Jacques Cartier arrived. Right? And we love to celebrate Jacques Cartier arriving in Canada. Woo! Samuel de Champlain, woo! Right? I went to Trent University. We had a college named after Samuel de Champlain. Really big on that colonization thing, right? But when folks first started arriving, that's when colonization started to happen. Sometimes we think it's about, oh, when we built the first city or we built the first town, right? But it was really when they first arrived. That idea that they were coming to this land to discover new land for themselves was in itself colonization. Now we do get into our first settlement in 1605 in Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia, right? And then in 1760, we start to see the conversion of Inuit to Christianity in Nunatsiavut. And that's also a big part of colonization, right? The implementing or enforcing of your own religion on these communities. So again, it's not simply just creating a settlement, right? It's how you're enforcing your ways on these communities. We then see in 1791, the establishment of Upper Canada. And a little interesting fact, this is a side thing, but Upper Canada actually used to use Black folks to settle in areas where they had displaced Indigenous people in order to claim land. Right? So when we're talking about later, when we talk about am I a settler as a racialized person, how have we as racialized people been used also in this system of colonization and displacing people? And then in 1867, Canada becomes a country. Again, they love celebrating that. Woo, Canada. Not really, but it's something they love, right? And again, this isn't a complete timeline of all of the things that have happened in Canada, colonization-wise, but these are some of the big moments. So 1867, Canada becomes a country. Canada cannot exist without treaties. It literally could not, right? The Crown saw Indigenous people, and I think this is always such an interesting thing when I think about it now and how Indigenous people are treated today. The Crown saw Indigenous people as sovereign nations, right? That they had to engage in agreements with in order to build Canada. Now, the ways in which the government talks about Indigenous people now doesn't sound like we're sovereign nations, does it? Right? When we get into those settlements, those Métis settlements, I highly recommend reading the Alberta Métis Settlement Act and read how they talk about Métis people, right? But treaties were supposed to be official agreements between states, nations, or governments. And they outline different conditions to both parties involved. So you might read Treaty Number 9, and it might sound different, or there might be different things in it than Treaty Number 7, right? Not all treaties are the same. I think there's also that misconception that all treaties are the same. On Treaty Day, for some people, they might get $5. If anyone knows of Six Nations of the Grand River, which is outside of Toronto, Brantford area, they get a block of cheese on their treaty day, right? Treaty agreements look different everywhere. How the government honors those treaties looks different everywhere, right? A block of cheese over here, $5 over here, right? It looks different. So each treaty is a product of the area's history, social, and political environment. Like I said, it is the building blocks for Canada. Now, the main intention of treaties or what was supposed to be the main intention of treaties, were that they were entered into for mutual benefit, and it was for peace. Now we can understand now that most of those treaties weren't entered into in those ways. Some nations were forced into signing treaties through starvation. Some people showed up to sign treaties and the translator did not translate the treaties correctly. And some nations didn't get a translator at all. So while Canada loves to celebrate this idea of treaties, these are the building blocks of Canada, right? How those treaties were signed and in what ways matters, right? If someone holds a gun to your head and says, sign this, is it the same as willingly going to sign it? No, right? So even when we're thinking about treaties, we have to think about them in a critical way, right? We can't just simply celebrate it. I heard someone once say that when they became a Canadian citizen, that they wish they could have signed their allegiance to the treaties of the area that they were in. And that sounds good in theory, but if that treaty is not benefiting that nation, what does that mean, right? So again, when we're thinking even about treaties, it's important to think about the nations within those treaties. How are those treaties affecting them, right? So this is a timeline of treaties again. So I want to acknowledge that treaties existed on these lands for thousands of years prior to colonization. Has anyone here heard of the two-row wampum? And there, yeah, two-row wampum. That is a treaty, right? The dish with one spoon wampum that exists in what we now call Toronto was a treaty that existed prior to colonization. That was between nations. Wampums existed on these lands for thousands of years prior to settlers arriving. We then see the Royal Proclamation in 1763, sounds like a long time ago, right? Where by law, First Nation peoples were recognized again as sovereign nations, right? Sovereign nations, not people who had to be cared for by the state, but sovereign nations that had a right to their lands and their communities. We also see pre-Confederation treaties. So peace and friendship treaties is something you're going to see a lot on the East Coast, right, in Mi'kmaq territory. And then we start to see our numbered treaties in 1871 to 1921. So even when we're thinking about treaties, there's different treaties, different levels of treaties, different time periods, right? Again, not all treaties are the same. So when you're thinking about being in solidarity with Indigenous people, again, looking at treaties matters. How do you honor those agreements? How do the nations want you to honor those agreements? So I have a little activity. So I want folks to take out your phones if you have them, your laptops, your iPads, whatever you have. And I want you to think about, where are you located? Like, where do you live, right? Whether it's here in Ottawa, whether it's in Toronto, maybe it's in Vancouver, wherever you live. I want you to think about your connection to it. So I want you to write down maybe just a sentence of what your connection to that land is. What does it mean for you? And then as you're going through your phone, I want you to look up what treaty or land claim you fall under and whose traditional territory it is, right? I want you to look it up. Now we know this is the traditional territory, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people here in Ottawa, right? But where you're from, what nations took care of those lands prior to colonization? And there might be many nations. There might be disputed nations. As someone who has an Anishinaabe family, this running joke between Anishinaabe folks and Haudenosaunee folks over whose land, who was taking care of the land longer, who was there first. Little running joke. I always love when elders start to get into it. It's really funny. But who were caretakers of those lands? I'm going to give y'all a couple minutes. And then whenever someone's ready, if you already know, you can raise your hand and I want you to share. Whose land do you live on? Yeah, go ahead. Scarborough. Mhm.
So I live in Scarborough in Toronto, and we live in on the lot of many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. But more specifically, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat's people. And I believe it's covered by Treaty 13.
Absolutely, yes. And what does it mean to you? Sorry, I was just gonna. What does it mean to you to be on that land?
I'm still trying to figure out. I came 6 years ago to Canada, and like when I arrived to Canada, I did not have enough knowledge about Indigenous communities, culture, and language, or even like the history of what Canada have done and the harm that was caused to Indigenous communities. But I truly believe that I feel I have connection to the land, and I feel I'm trying to discover by connecting with Indigenous folks and talking to them and just listening to them, because I still don't know what is Canada, and this is something I'm hoping to discover.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's absolutely valid. Even as an Indigenous person, sometimes I'm like, what is my relationship to the land? How has it been disturbed? What does it mean to be here? Right? Toronto's not my traditional territory, but I've lived there most of my life. What does it mean to be there? Right? There was another hand over there.
I live in Amiskitchi-Waskagan in Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux, and Saulteaux, I believe. And I guess it's just as a settler learning our history and kind of how it became, Edmonton.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, sometimes it's just learning. How did the city even come to exist? Right? And then you can figure out, well, what does it mean to be here now? So thank you for sharing that. There was a hand right there.
I live in St. John's, Newfoundland, which was the traditional lands of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq. And there was a genocide. So Beothuk culture has been absolutely destroyed. So there's actually no treaties on the actual island because of that I'm aware of. But I feel very lucky to be there. It's beautiful, and there's a lot of really rich history, and many of our names are actually still like Beothuk names for areas. And there's been really interesting work by Mi'kmaq nations to like talk about what traditional names were and what they mean and how they inform like the geography of the land. So it's very complex, because as a settler person, I feel very angry that there was such a rich culture and it was destroyed through genocidal acts. But I also see how that continues to impact the Indigenous folks who live and work on the land, and how that like just translates into every experience they have. Yeah, I feel very complex about it.
No, thank you for sharing. It is complex when you're learning for the first time, like what happened on these lands and how are the communities still being affected. We'll go there and then over there as well.
Okay, Nestilgok Abikhuikamataki. I live on the traditional lands that my ancestors lived, which is Blackfoot Confederacy in Southern Alberta, or Southern Alberta existed after Blackfoot Confederacy. And the name for my territory is Siksigatitabi, and we speak Blackfoot. And I love my land, the land I'm from. I'm connected to it. I'm one with it. And prior to signing Treaty Number 7, we were a fierceful nation. It expands from Edmonton down to Yellowstone National Park, into Saskatchewan and the Rocky Mountains that border Alberta and British Columbia. Our warriors were fierce, and that includes women. And today we still speak our language. Right now, my tribe that I live on, am from, the Blood Tribe. We are 13,000 plus population. We are actually the largest geographical reserve in Canada. And it means a great deal for me to share this here with you. I live, breathe, and walk as a Siksikittipi woman and spirit. And I practice my ancestral ways of knowing and being. So thank you for letting me share that today.
Shimigwech, Marcy, thank you for sharing that. It's super important. And I think oftentimes when we think about Indigenous people, the idea of displacement is the only thing that we have in our minds. So what does it mean to still be on your traditional territories and have that connection to land and language? So thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. And then we have one more back there.
I'm moving from Treaty 4 land, but I'm headed towards Treaty 6 in Saskatoon. And the area that I'm going to be living on is going to be primarily Cree land. I am very much a settler, so my connection with the land is primarily that I'm just still trying to learn the history, and I'm wanting to catch up on everything that hasn't been taught in schools and hasn't been, because I mean, I'm still pretty young, so they are teaching the newer things that haven't been taught to past generations, but it still doesn't feel like enough. So I'm still wanting to learn more.
Thank you. And there's a person that's had their hand back up there for a while, so I'm going to let them go. But I just want to say thank you for sharing that, because education is a big part of it, right? Relearning stuff, because yeah, schools don't really teach much.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I grew up on the land of the Kwantlen people.
It's a little low. Can you speak up?
Yeah.
Just, there you
I
go.
grew up on the land of the Kwantlen people, so in a small town outside of Vancouver in BC, or so-called Vancouver. But I did move to Vancouver, which is the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known generally as the Coast Salish peoples. I did just look it up, and it's called the Douglas Treaties. I had never looked that up before, so that's something that I did not know. I'm also very much a settler, but I grew up, very close to the reserve of the Kwantlen people, and a lot of my loved ones and a lot of people that I consider family also grew up on that reserve. And I think that the best way that I, try to connect with the land, or how I feel towards the land, is if I practice, as a settler, my main concern is practicing love and respect and learning from the people that have lived here for generations before me, and respecting them in every walk of life to the best of my ability.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, connection to the people and the land are important. Sometimes when we talk about land acknowledgements, right, we only think about our relationship to the land. I have a few hands. I'm gonna do over here just because we've had a lot of folks over here. But these last two are gonna be the last, and then we'll move on to the next slide. They're just talking about the mic. We just need a mic over here. Sorry, I have you running back and forth.
Yeah, it's on. So I just came to Canada like 10 months ago. I have been trying to do my research. I live in close to Montreal, which is known originally as Tiohtià:ke. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, or Muniang, depending on which sub tribe language you're asking, and which was part of the tribes that lived there were part of the Iroquois Confederacy who lived in Quebec. I'm originally from Lebanon, which is a country that has experienced colonialism, especially modern colonialism, and is still experiencing, in my opinion at least, some form of neo-colonialism. So from the moment I started learning about the history of the land that is now known as Canada and the United States of America, it connected in a way with me, also with the history of my people and the Middle East in general, and the suffering that was a little bit the same. So I'm trying to learn more about that and respect and honor it.
Thank you for sharing. We just put one more person back there. Yeah, sometimes our relationship is, what does it mean to come from places that have also been colonized? And what does it look like, right? Like, I think of my grandma often when she left the Caribbean and came to Canada. And during the time that she left the Caribbean, Black activist groups in the Caribbean, specifically in Trinidad, were like bombing Canadian banks because they were like, we want you out. We're tired of Canadian imperialism in Trinidad. And then she came to Canada, right? So it's like that interesting relationship of like being from somewhere that's colonized and coming to a place that's also colonized. And sometimes that place is colonizing the place that you're from. It's really complex. And yeah, the last one back there.
You folks hear me? Okay, perfect. So I recently moved to Gatineau, and so unceded Iroquois territory, but still trying to learn what is named and unnamed here. But I grew up, many of my formative years were in Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Dish-with-One-Spoon, Tura Wampum territory, so known along settler lines as St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. And it's interesting because I have been in spaces with Indigenous folks and been very much conscious of naming what during land acknowledgements, but also pushing the consciousness around like what are land acknowledgements beyond just naming? Like, is it just the dancey dance we do at the beginning of a session of like, these are the communities? So when I think about the second question here of what is your connection to it as someone who is not Indigenous to this land, but and I'm glad that we're talking in the latter half of this session about like, what does it mean to be a settler? But the sticky identity of being not a white person on this land, but also being someone who's not Indigenous to this land. For me, I'm like, as someone who is not Indigenous, but still benefits from the systems that have intentionally and systemically marginalized Indigenous people. Part of my land acknowledgement and my consciousness is also asking the question of, because I know that I benefit from being on land that was not ceded or fairly ceded, there is a responsibility upon me to make sure that whatever space I'm in, the land acknowledgement is a framing for what are the skills I'm taking away that will allow me to be a better ally, that will allow me to stand in solidarity. So that's kind of the what is your connection piece for it for me.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And that actually gets to the point of this activity, right? That land.
Merci. Quand il s'agit de la revendication, de la reconnaissance du territoire et de savoir que voilà, c'est un territoire traditionnel. Et là, on se pose la question, quels ont été les traités qui ont eu sur ce territoire? C'est très important parce que de nos jours, il y a beaucoup de reconnaissance de territoire qui dit, voilà, c'est le territoire traditionnel de tel et tel. Mais on doit aller au-delà. Les organisations m'ont demandé de commencer comme ça, avec une reconnaissance de territoire. J'ai dit, moi, je ne peux pas parler de la relation avec le territoire de quelqu'un, avec la terre de quelqu'un d'autre. Je connais la mienne, mais je ne représente pas la vôtre. Donc, cette reconnaissance de territoire, cette reconnaissance des gens, eh bien, cela doit être plus profond. Ce ne doit pas être seulement le fait de dire, voilà, le territoire de telle ou telle nation. C'est pour ça que je demande aux gens de me raconter les histoires ou les expériences qu'ils ont avec le territoire sur lequel ils vivent. Une reconnaissance de territoire ne peut pas forcément dire quelque chose à tout le monde, puisque cela dépend de chacun. Quand il s'agit de traités, sachez qu'il y a des utilisations qui sont conflictuelles. Alors voilà, on vous dit, ah, les gouvernements ont dit, on a fait un traité de façon paisible, on a construit le pays, tout ça. Mais beaucoup de ces traités pour les autochtones, on sait très bien que les traités n'ont pas toujours été faits de manière très juste. Alors, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de savoir qu'on est dans un traité et
And because of the US-Canada border, we could not freely visit our relatives in Montana, even though our territory was there since time began, right? And the signing of Treaty Number 7 in 1877, our chief of the time, Chief Red Crow, was a fierce warrior, and there was no sign of him the days prior to September 22nd, 1877. But the other chief, Chief Crowfoot, who was actually from my tribe, adopted into Siksika. He was thought of at the time to be a negotiator. So when Red Crow wasn't showing up yet, Crowfoot said he'll be here. We spoke before, and this was all in Blackfoot. Remember, this is an interpretation from oral historians. The 11th hour, Red Crow showed up. And he told Crowfoot, if this is our way forward, then we will sign, because it'll ensure that our children and their children in turn will have the benefits of the treaty agreement. Now people tell me, well, you get your education paid for, you get your health paid for. And I'll sometimes say bullshit, because I still have to buy into a insurance plan to help pay for my dental and health benefits now. And you know what? I'm one of the treaty people that still get $5 every year. But our land keeps wanting to be taken, and our rights keep wanting to be taken. And I have to make sure, as a woman, I have 4 children and 6 grandsons, that my grandsons never have to fight for what is inherently theirs. So it's a challenge when we want to teach. I'm going to pose a question to all of you, and I respect the speaker here. Your ancestors cheated you for not knowing this today in the year 2022. And these treaties were signed in the 1800s. So you have the responsibility now that you know this to lobby, advocate, and fight for not only equality, but equity. And so that this truth and reconciliation calls to action is actually put into action. Do the hard work, feel it, because my parents and their parents, they're survivors of residential school. I'm not too far away, and I went to an Indian day school, and I'm that one. Oh, I was the one in the classroom. Oh, your First Nations, tell us how it is. No, you should know. I'm just wanting to be me. I got to live in 2 worlds here. I got to make a life for my family, because reserve life isn't all that. It's, it's not all rosy. It's not. It's damn hard. Our language was taken. Our spirituality was taken, outlawed, right? You talk about putting the gun to your head. My grandparents only spoke Blackfoot, and they were ceremonialists, and they were told, if you practice this, you're going to jail. My mom, she was the youngest daughter of 12 children. The Indian agent showed up with the RCMP, and they knocked on the door, and they said, we're here to take your daughter to residential school. And my grandmother told my grandfather, you have to let them take her. Otherwise, do you want your baby girl to see the police officers take you to jail? That wasn't a voluntary choice. It was a forced action. Now, there's many stories like that, and I'm one voice here, but like she said, and like I felt yesterday, why am I the only one in the crowd, in the conversation? We have a ways to go, and I'm very, very blessed and fortunate. Creator gave me the voice now after many years of healing my own traumas, both lived and historical and intergenerational. How the hell is this hillbilly res girl here speaking to people? It's the voice, the strength, the survival of the ancestors. but we have to feel it, people. We have to feel it. I think she's being kind and gentle in her presentation. If we don't feel it, we haven't made much of a difference. If you want to cry, please do so. I still want to cry sometimes because people have to feel it. And that's that colonial monster that she's talking about and that I write about and talk about. It stripped you of your spirit. You're masked so that you don't feel it, that the government just tells you what to do and you do it. And you don't know why you're doing it, but everyone else is. The system sucks us of our spirit and our goodness. And we have to be able to recognize that. And I hope, and I'm pretty sure I'm doing a pretty good job after 50 years of going through what I went through. And now I'm 50. I've been 50 for a few months now. My children are pretty good people. I have 6 little warriors that I gotta mold and love and nurture so that they're never afraid, because warriors are not afraid to die. Any day is a good day to die when you know what you're doing is right. And so I'm going to do that for them, whatever venue I can, to educate, to talk, to speak to. Sometimes you don't like it, and that's okay. That's really okay. I'm not here to be liked. But this is the truth of the ancestral voices. And if I don't speak, then what good am I here? And I've never done things according to plan. I've always went against the grain all the time. And you know, that makes all the difference. So thank you for listening to me and sharing my history from my territory where I'm from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for being as vulnerable as you were, because it's hard, right? And this is why I'm saying to look into treaties and these things, because it's these stories, right? It's this history, not just history, but contemporary. It's the things that people are still going through, right? 1877, you said the treaty was signed? Still $5. And that's what, 300 years now? I'm not good at math. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't do a degree in math. I'm not good at math. We're gonna say 300 years of that treaty being signed, right? Of having to deal with the consequences of the actions of the government in relationship to that treaty. The residential schools, and we'll talk about it a bit, residential schools are a result of treaties, right? When Indigenous people said we want education, they didn't mean residential schools. But that's what the government came up with. So this question, what are some of the ways the government broke treaties or broken treaties? I feel like we've got our examples right there, right? But in many ways, the education system, healthcare, pipelines are a big way that the government is breaking treaties. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the foster care system, right? In the justice system, I was saying in the keynote, 36% of youth in the justice system are Indigenous youth, 36%. So I'm going to talk a bit about those Métis settlements that I talked about earlier. And again, I highly recommend reading the Métis Betterment Act, the Alberta Métis Betterment Act, and the Settlements Act, because it provided the legal transfer of land title to the Métis people. And it's kind of weird to tell Indigenous people, hey, we're legally allowing you to live on the land that you're from. Does that make sense? Right? Your people have been taking care of these lands for hundreds, thousands of years, and yet we're just giving you the legal rights to do so. So there are 8 Métis settlements in Alberta, and again, this is the difference between settlements and reserves, right? There's 8 settlements in Alberta. We have Buffalo Lake, East Prairie, Elizabeth, Fishing Lake, Gift Lake, Kikino, Paddle Prairie, and Peween. And these are all settlements that are in the prairies. Now, that's not to say that Métis people don't exist outside of these settlements. They very much do, and it's important to acknowledge that. But we also have to acknowledge the way in which Indigenous people have been forced into certain areas. We talked about the reserve and the border, the Canadian border, US border, breaking up traditional territories, right? And that was done so in a way to restrict the movement of Indigenous people. And this was also done, again, with Métis people and settlements. Now, one of the ways in which the government has resisted the movement of people is the Northwest resistance. And I'm calling it a resistance and not a rebellion, because rebellion kind of has this negative connotation. The government likes to say we rebelled, but we resisted colonization. There's also a misconception that the Northwest resistance was just made up of Métis people, and that's not true. Many First Nation communities also participated in the Northwest resistance, because this was a resistance of colonization moving farther into the West. Now, there were some settlers that were also a part of this, specifically Francophone settlers in the prairies that were worried about the expansion of the English language into the prairies. Love my Francophones, but you know, they decided to take up the mantle too, so I'm not going to complain too much. But this resistance, right, was stopped by the creation of the RCMP, or at the time, the Northwest Mounted Police. And when we're talking about colonization, we have to include policing. The RCMP was specifically created to oppress and to commit genocide against Indigenous people. That is why they were created. You can't get past that. That's why they exist. And I would argue that's why they still exist, right? But you have to acknowledge that the creation of this organization happened in order to stop Indigenous people from resisting the colonization of their lands and their communities. And during this, Louis Riel, who was a Métis leader at the time, was convicted, hung, and I'm going to say murdered, because it's important to say murdered, by the Canadian government. Now they celebrate him as the father of Manitoba, right? As one of the founding fathers of Confederation. This Métis man who resisted colonization is now being upheld by the Canadian government as a hero of it. And that's another form of colonization. When governments take Indigenous leaders, Indigenous peoples, and reframe them in a way that benefits their narrative. This idea that Louis Riel, right, was so proud to be a part of Confederation, despite the fact that he was murdered for resisting it. That then brings us to the pass system. And many people don't know about the pass system. And if they do know, they don't know that it was illegal. And I want to make this very clear. At no point did the Canadian government go to Parliament and get this passed into law. What happened is John A. Macdonald, I was going to say got on the phone, but they didn't have phones back then. John Macdonald probably wrote a letter to the chief of the RCMP at the time, saying that a pass system needed to be enforced on Indigenous people in the prairies, and specifically First Nation folks, because of their involvement in the Northwest resistance. They were punished for supporting and being in community with Métis people in resisting colonization. And to be honest, they often get forgotten in the conversation about the Northwest resistance. So because of this, what ended up happening is the RCMP and the Canadian government illegally created a system where Indigenous people in the prairies had to have a pass to leave their reserve. And that was for anything. You had to get a pass even if the next reserve was maybe 2 hours away. You had to get a pass for birthdays, marriages, deaths. If you were caught off the reserve without a pass, you were in prison. Now, this might sound like something from the 1800s, but they found passes as late as 1970. That's not that long ago. 1970, Indigenous people still had to get a pass to leave their reserves. Now, you might say, why weren't they more vocal about this? Remember, they also weren't allowed to hire lawyers. And you can't really organize a resistance if you can't leave your reserve in the first place. And again, this was illegally enforced by the Canadian government. So oftentimes when we talk about colonization, we think about it as laws and policies that were put in place, but sometimes it was just plain old racism. There were no laws, there were no policies because they knew they couldn't pass them. So this idea, right, the government loves to tell Indigenous people, protest legally, follow the law, except they never seem to do it when they're oppressing us. Right? So I always find it so funny when police officers for protests are like, well, you know, you don't have a right to be protesting right now. You know, like you didn't come to us first, as if I'm gonna call the police and be like, hey, I'm about to protest you today, right? But this idea that we have to follow these rules in our resistance of colonization when we have things like this which were going on as late as 1970. And that's also not getting into segregated schools, right? In places where folks weren't in residential schools or Indian day schools, they still were in segregated schools. So we're gonna watch this video right now, and it's gonna talk about residential schools, and I'm gonna talk about the 60 scoop, which is also something that a lot of people don't know about. So we can play the video.
For more than 200 years, religious orders run mission schools for Indigenous children, the precursors to the Government of Canada's residential school system. The Mohawk Institute becomes a boarding school. Run by the Anglican Church, it is the first government-funded residential school in Canada. A government report recommends Indigenous children be separated from their parents in order to assimilate them into Western culture. These recommendations influence federal laws and policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their culture and rights. ΗLE-A-CROSSE opens in northern Saskatchewan. The majority of students are Métis. The government takes authority over Indigenous people and education for First Nations. The Indian Act gives the Canadian government control over Indigenous rights and culture. The Act includes only First Nations as status Indians. It excludes Métis and Inuit. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures. The number of schools across Canada quickly climbs to over 40. The Government of Canada requires First Nations children aged 7 to 16 to attend residential school. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce exposes the government's neglect of Indigenous children's health, including alarmingly high death rates of residential school students. More than 80 institutions are in operation across Canada, the most at any one time. 4 students are investigated for arson. Others reportedly cheer as they watch the school burn. This is one of dozens of fires set by students across Canada as a form of resistance. Inuit children are officially included in the residential school system. 6 schools open in the Western Arctic as the government takes over the administration of many church-run residential schools. Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall open in Inuvik, housing 500 students. More than 20,000 Indigenous children are taken from their families by government social workers and placed in foster care or adoption homes, often with non-Indigenous families. Adoptees lose connection with their Indigenous language, culture, and identity. 12-year-old Chani Wenjak dies after escaping from the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School. A formal investigation follows. The all-white jury finds that residential schools cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems. the Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining schools from the churches. Thousands of Indigenous students are enrolled at the 28 residential schools that are still running in Canada. Phil Fontaine, head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly of the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. He calls for a public inquiry, which the federal government initiates in 1991. Gordon's Residential School is the last federally run school to close. The report recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools, including language loss and trauma. The government provides compensation to survivors, including the Common Experience Payment and a focus on funding and supporting Indigenous health and healing services. The agreement establishes funds for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to former students, their families, and communities for Canada's role in the operation of residential schools. Provincial and territorial apologies follow in the years ahead. After hosting events across Canada, the TRC releases a summary of its findings. It includes 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential schools and assisting in the process of Canadian reconciliation. The new centre holds a permanent archive of materials and testimonies on residential schools gathered during the TRC. The TRC characterizes Canada's treatment of Indigenous people as cultural genocide. Thousands of children died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy.
Many people have said over the years, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget.
I always find so interesting about this video. There's a couple of things. So the first one is in 1867, when Canada became a country, they decided to take over running residential schools. That was a moment where they could have said no, when you think about it, right? The Crown, England was handing over this horrific system to what was going to be Canada. And in that moment, Canada decided to say, no, this is who we are. We could have been somebody different. We could have been a different place, a different nation. But in that moment, Canada said, it's more important for us to establish a white nation than it is for us to save the lives of Indigenous children. The second thing is in 1922, when that report came out, talking about the treatment that was happening to Indigenous children, and the government still said, 50 more years of this. There were moments, there were always moments for the Canadian government, for Canadian society to stand up in solidarity with Indigenous people and say no. It took not until 1996 for residential schools to be closed. This narrative that we like to paint that people just didn't know is not true. People knew, they just didn't care, or didn't care enough to do anything about it. I said earlier I went to Trent University, and I went to a lecture hall that was named after Chanie Wenjack. I went into that lecture hall at least 3 times a week. And as an Indigenous person, what it meant to walk in that room and see his name, and to know that I'm walking into a room named after a child who froze to death. Chanie Wenjack didn't simply just die, he froze to death trying to get home. And what it meant for me every day to walk into that lecture hall in a way that it didn't mean for other people, that they didn't even notice, that they didn't even care. Those are the effects of colonization, right? It's not simply just this, it's the fact that Indigenous people have to live with it every day, that we have to remember every day the lives that were lost. When we think about the 60 scoop, and another interesting thing about the video, oh, Indigenous children were put up for foster care. No, they were stolen. There are accounts of social workers standing on the outskirts of reserves and tricking Indigenous children to come off of them by offering them ice cream or candy and then putting them into a car and putting them up for adoption. There are stories of grandmothers taking care of their grandchildren while the mothers worked and did things, and that was used as neglect. How many of us were raised by our grandparents? How many of us spent time in our grandparents' home? And imagine simply having a day out with your grandmother meant that the government could come and take you. Or the story of some of these children that were taken out of residential schools and put up for adoption in the United States. You just wake up one morning and you're in a whole other country, living with a white family. And when we talk about the compensation that's supposed to happen for residential school survivors, we don't talk about the stories of folks whose names were changed. And so when they go to get compensation, they can't, because they can't show proof that they were even there because their name was changed. Or the fact that survivors have to, in detail, talk about their abuse in order to get compensation. It's not simply enough that they went to the school. They have to literally talk about all of the abuse they suffered to even be considered for compensation. So when we're talking about solidarity, it can't simply just be, we're going to throw money at you, or we're going to give an apology, right? It has to be that you have to acknowledge that the systems that you've even supposedly created to support Indigenous people don't actually allow them access to gain justice. So I want to ask folks, based after watching this, and also for folks who are, this was really heavy, and if you need to take a moment to step out, please do so. Take that moment for yourself. But I want to ask folks, what are some ways that you think these events have left long-lasting effects on Indigenous peoples in Canada? Because there's certain stereotypes and narratives people like to paint about Indigenous people. We're alcoholics, we're addicts, right? It's a big one. That was 400 years of genocide. I might drink too. And I don't have access to adequate health care. Practicing my ceremony was illegal until the 70s. Residential schools were still open then, right? There's no way to deal with the trauma. So we get stereotypes like that. So that's one example. The stereotype that Indigenous people are inherently alcoholics and addicts, which is not statistically true. White people are more likely to drink, right? But it's an easy narrative to paint when you're not talking about what y'all just watched. And again, the fact that folks don't have access to adequate resources. Indigenous youth in the North have to get shipped down to Ottawa and Montreal, right? To get support. They can't even stay in their community. What does it mean to not be able to get the mental health support and resources that you need, not even in your community? You have to leave. Yep.
The long-lasting effects are that my dad received a large sum for his settlement, and that only means that he was sexually abused, but my dad doesn't talk about it. And that meant he used alcohol to numb his pain, and he didn't become sober until I was 20 years old. That also meant that that's what I knew in a partner. And that's why I raised my 4 children and I put myself through school, because there is something in my spirit that said, Never give up. Make the change. That meant that my son, who is now 31, who was a damn good athlete, he could have made it to the NHL. In fact, some of his teammates are there, but because of the trauma, the racism, the stereotyping, but just also the connection that he has to us, they kept him. This system kept him from playing in the NHL. He was in Brandon with the Wheat Kings, and he was so good. So I live it every day. But I also remember the ancestral strength and voices. And I'm speaking from the heart. And when I do that, I cry, I have tears. It means that the strength comes forward in knowing I have survived, I have overcome, and I will continue. But not anybody here knew my story and how all this history affects me, because we didn't do it to ourselves. It was done to us over and over and over again. And today, if I didn't have a PhD, I would still be labeled as such. Or you're an Indian woman. Why can't you take care of this or that? And excuse my language, and I say, fuck you, oppression. Fuck you, colonization. I'm here as a First Nations Siksikaitsitabi woman, and I will always be here if I have anything to do with it. So this is what I live with every day. I have also chosen to forgive because my partner, my parents did not know any different. So I forgive because I understand. My children forgive me for not living with their dad because I couldn't. Maybe I would have ended up drinking and my children might have been taken away from me. But by chance, by choice, I'm here. And I think me coming here, some might say I'm a thorn in the side. Actually, no, I'm that voice. I'm the reminder that this is real. This is very real. And my children today continue to fight. They're still being oppressed in systems that aren't naturally our systems, but we operate in the systems that have been created. And I'm doing my best to push and dismantle those systems so that all of us here, when we talk about women and children, that we don't have to fight governments to get the funding, to make the changes that are so needed. But we must clean up our backyard, which means the history. And we must understand it, and we must respect it, and we must create those changes first to then therefore take care of all the other elements, right? We must, because you're in my territory. I'm not in yours. If I was in South America, I would honor the people there. It's not my territory. I'm there to work for you and with you, but I don't own it. I can't do anything about the land or the systems because I'm a visitor and I must respect my role in that. So that is my call to action, is clean our own backyard. before we want to build something new. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple more hands. Yeah, you didn't get a chance to speak last time, and then
I grew up on the South Shore of Montreal, and I went to school in Montreal, which meant I had to take the Mercier Bridge to get to school, which the road takes you through the Kanawaki Reserve, which is mostly Mohawk people, I believe. And which meant that every single day I would drive by this huge picture that it had put up of a missing girl, and her name is Tiffany Morrison. And I would drive by that picture every single day. And I was young. I did not know the extent of the hurt that Indigenous people had been through. And my understanding of Indigenous people was forged by the opinions of my family members, which, if I'm being honest, were racist. And I had to wait all the way to university to learn about the history and learn like what happened or probably happened to that person that whose pictures I drove by every single day.
thank you for sharing that. And it is hard, right? Like when we're talking about those lasting effects, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks and men are a part of that, right? Like that having to drive past every day and what it meant for that community to have to look up at every day and know that that person was still missing, that person from their community still wasn't home, right? And being honest about sometimes our family is really racist. I'll never forget my aunt's husband looking at me and saying, because you're Black and Native, you will be nothing. Like I was 14 years old and I had this dream of watching Criminal Minds. I was like, I'm gonna be a criminologist and I'm gonna do amazing things. And he literally looked me in the face and said, because you're Black and Native, you will amount to nothing, right? And that was my uncle. Sometimes it's our families that perpetuate those beliefs, right? When we're talking about long-lasting effects, it's the long-lasting effects of racism, right? It's not always just the system. Yes, we can argue about the system and lack of access to resources, but sometimes it's also the racism that has existed and lasted throughout family. So I'm gonna take two more folks because we gotta move on. We're gonna go here and then you, is that okay? Trying to get folks who haven't spoken yet.
Sorry, can you guys hear me? Yeah. So my daughter is 17 months and her great grandmother was in the residential school. She's part of the George Gordon Nation. And long-lasting effect for me is like, I want my daughter to know her history and to know her Indigenous heritage, but her great grandma can't talk about it. Like she beads, so she's teaching, like she's showing her the beadings and like that part of the culture, but everything else is so painful for her that I feel is a long lasting effect, because the new generation of Indigenous children are missing out on their culture because they don't have elders to teach them because it's too painful to teach. So in coming to these workshops and learning about it, I'm hoping that I can try to teach her and I can try to give her, sorry, this is very emotional for me.
Don't apologize.
I can try to teach her, but it's like, it's not my history to teach because I'm Afro-European, so I can teach her that, but I don't want her to miss on that heritage. So yeah, that was my share.
Thank you for sharing. And it's a very important part of that, right? That cultural genocide and the fact that it's not being able to be passed on. I dated a Mohawk man for 6 years, and I in the beginning was really upset that he didn't know his culture. Like I was like, you had this opportunity to learn and you're not taking it. And so I took it upon myself. I was really up in every Haudenosaunee social. And I was like trying to learn as much as I could because I was like, when we have children, it's important for me to know this. And it was hard because it's like, I'm not Haudenosaunee and this isn't my culture. And I had to come to the moment to understand, like you're saying, about that pain. That for him, it wasn't that he didn't want to learn his culture. is that his mom couldn't share it with him because of her pain, and her parents couldn't share it with her because of their pain, right? It's that intergenerational trauma that ends up resulting in now your daughter not being able to learn from her great grandmother. In the same way that my partner wasn't willing to learn because it was too traumatic for him, right? My ex-partner. So that's also, right, intergenerational trauma, and that how that then affects younger generations. And we're going to take one more right here. You had your hand up.
Really fortunate enough to learn a lot from community members, and something that I really hold with me is that it's not past tense. And I've been really fortunate to learn about policies and about identification cards, and how a lot of folks are like, oh yeah, Indigenous people get access to all these resources and stuff, but it's like the lineage of accessing even identification cards is such bullshit, and I'm not the person to explain it to you, but getting access to that, the fact that there is this epidemic with missing and murdered Indigenous women, the fact that people from the 60s scoop are still meeting their siblings now, like to date, is just like, it's not something that I can sit with and say that's Canada's history, it's Canada's present. And it's the government has manipulated it in a way to make it seem like, oh, it's the system's fault, but they're still putting policies forward that are continuously oppressing people. And Justin Trudeau is full of shit every time he goes to community members and then still refuses to give them access to clean drinking water. I have a very racist family, and the fact that my father, who is inherently got a lot of issues, can like comprehend that the fact that we live in Canada and not everybody has access to clean drinking water is absolute, like, it's devastating. And it's the consistent, if they wanted Indigenous people to survive and thrive, they would give them access to water. And that's something that, I mean, I'm looking at you like I need to explain it to you, but like the fact that that's still happening, and it's super ingrained in our policies, and especially the politicians. And something that I really think about when I'm voting is who's going to, you know, give those folks access to that comprehensive care and the resources that they need, and who's actually going to put forward policies that aren't full of nothing. It's something that I try and do as a settler, and then also learn from community members, and going to those protests and making sure that community members are safe when they're doing that is something that's also really important, because the RCMP is also full of shit, like a lot of things in Canada, sorry. And making sure that community members are always safe when doing those kind of calls to action for white people. And I really call a lot of white folks and a lot of settlers to go to those protests and go to those rallies and ally with community members, because they need us, and they also need our votes, because unfortunately that's what is going to get these policies moving forward. And it sucks that it's a shit system, but you know, it's, I think, our responsibility. So
thank you for sharing. Yeah, you know, it's when we're talking about Justin Trudeau full of shit, it's him. It's him visiting the unmarked graves of Indigenous children while also suing Indigenous child welfare organizations. You know, it's like a little bit of that. It's like you're showing up and like, oh my God, I'm so sad, but you're also suing folks who are trying to get resources, right? But yeah, that absolutely, right? These long-lasting effects look like things like that. So this, again, folks have already mentioned, but the ongoing effects of colonization, we already talked about lack of clean drinking water, lack of access to adequate healthcare, high rates of suicide. So First Nation folks are 3 times more likely to take their own lives. Métis folks 2 times more likely. Inuit 9 times more likely. There's an overrepresentation in the foster care system. So 52% of children in the foster care system are Indigenous, though Indigenous children represent only 7.7% of the child population in Canada. There are more children now in the foster care system than there were at the height of residential schools. There are so many children in the foster care system in Manitoba that they've started to put them into motels because they have no room for them, right? So when we're talking about long-lasting effects, it looks like still doing it, right? it's still affecting generations. It's still affecting people currently today. So when we're talking about being a settler, am I a settler? That's a question, especially from a lot of racialized folks that I've heard, right? Because you're not white. So what does it mean to be on these lands? So through a lot of conversations, and people have differing opinions, but when we're talking about settlers, right, we're specifically talking about folks who come from places that benefit from settler colonialism or help to establish settler states here. But just because you might not be a settler as a Black person or a refugee does not mean that you do not benefit or uphold settler colonialism. And that's the important part that you have to remember. Just because you're not white does not mean that you don't perpetuate the systems that still affect Indigenous people on these lands. Right? And it's something that you have to acknowledge. Well, yes, your family didn't come here and settle or take, right? You're still benefiting from a system that's doing it on your behalf. I can recognize that as a person who's part Black, whose family are immigrants, that they benefited from coming to Canada in a way in which that they were not benefiting in the place that they were. Now, again, we can get into the semantics of the fact that Canada was making it that way, right? But I have to acknowledge the fact that by coming here, my family had access to certain resources that my mom's side of the family did not, right? Clean drinking water being one of them. Access to culture, right? Canada talks about being a multicultural place and the fact that we are allowing everyone to simply just be themselves in their cultures and languages and customs. Now, we can argue that also is not true, right? But that's the narrative that Canada likes to paint until it comes to Indigenous people. And the only time Canada likes to uplift Indigenous people is when it pushes their narrative of being an amazing place, right? But as people who are refugees or arrivants, right, depending on where you're from, you have a responsibility to Indigenous people on these lands. You have the same responsibility as settlers. Now, settlers have a bit more, but you still have the same responsibilities, helping to dismantle systems. And oftentimes, these systems are the same systems that also oppress you. And I understand that it's hard, right? Folks have talked about recently coming to Canada and not learning things about Indigenous people. My stepfather got his citizenship not too long ago. And I remember helping him study for the test. Now, first of all, I think it's so funny because I barely knew anything on that test. So like, I don't know how I qualify as a Canadian other than being born here. But the fact that there was like one little paragraph about Indigenous people, and it was like, Canada's in relationship with Indigenous people, that didn't prepare my stepdad, if he hadn't have been with my mom, on how to be in relationships with Indigenous people on these lands, or to even know what the history of Indigenous people are on these lands. So how, as a person who is an arrivant, right, or a refugee, or a migrant, or an immigrant, how are you expected to be in relationship with Indigenous people if sometimes you don't even know Indigenous people exist on these lands? Because Canada's done a really great job at only parading Indigenous people around when it's important to them, right? How are you supposed to know how to support the needs of Indigenous people when you don't know that they don't have access to clean drinking water, right? And also when you get here, when you're bombarded with all of these stereotypes and misconceptions of Indigenous people from people who have been here much longer than you, how are you to know that these are stereotypes? How are you to know that this is simply just racism? It's on you to learn. And that's where you come in, right? That's where not upholding settler colonialism comes in. Now, being here, you're automatically upholding settler colonialism because Canada exists. And until Canada doesn't exist, settler colonialism still does, right? So it's really about how do we show up in better ways for Indigenous people. It's like talking about colonialism that happens in our nations and the relationship to that and to here. Being able to talk about, okay, I come from Lebanon, and how has settler colonialism affected my family and my community and my nation? What are the similarities here? Displacement of land, stealing of resources, culture, right? Racism, discrimination, all of these things. Those things that you know about your own nations can also be applied here. Now, obviously, there's going to be nuances and differences, and this is where it comes in, having actual relationships with Indigenous people to these lands. But I've met a lot of folks that have this fear of having these conversations because they feel like they can't understand, or they feel like they can't have these conversations as immigrants or refugees or migrants. But it's important for you to have these conversations. It's important to understand the nuances. That yes, colonialism pushed me out of my country to another country where I'm upholding the same colonialism that I just left. And that's something you have to challenge within yourself, and even sometimes in your own nations. I went to a conference for Caribbean Indigenous people, and I met a man from Trinidad. And when he approached me, he said, "I apologize for sounding like my oppressor." Now, as the child of an immigrant who was born in Trinidad, my grandmother, having her accent to me was a sense of resilience. That she didn't assimilate into Canadian society, that she kept her accent in a way in which my father didn't because he assimilated due to racism. To me, I took pride in that. But to have an Indigenous person from Trinidad look me in my face and tell me that same accent represented his oppressor was something that I really had to be like, oh shit, that accent doesn't necessarily mean what I think it means. And then also unpacking what it meant to be the descendants of enslaved people and how that accent was in fact a representation of our oppressors. The fact that my family doesn't have African names. My last name's Steele, that is a slave name. My grandmother's last name is Bedeau, that is a slave name. I know that. And even though I take pride in those last names because they connect me to home, it still doesn't change the fact that those are the last names and the representation of my oppression. That accent that I take pride in is a representation of my oppression. So sometimes you have to challenge even your own thinking of your identity from the places that you're from. You might be the descendant of colonizers even in the places that you've come from. And what does that mean? I've met a lot of folks from Latin America who are white people who speak Spanish. And it's important to make that distinction. They are white people who speak Spanish because their ancestors were colonizers who came to Latin America that refuse to acknowledge that history of being a part of what still is the ruling class in a lot of Latin American countries. If you come from a country that has a large dark-skinned population, but all of your representation looks light-skinned, that is something that you have to unpack. Sometimes even our heroes upheld settler colonialism, right? So even when we're questioning, am I a settler? You might not be a settler here, but you could be a settler where you're from. And what does that mean? Right? It's thinking about your responsibility in challenging settler colonialism, not just here, but globally. Because if you only focus on here, you're never actually challenging settler colonialism, because it means you're just going to uphold it in other ways. So I'm going to ask folks, what are some ways that you feel that you benefit from settler colonialism? Yep. A Canadian passport, absolutely. Absolutely. I was in the US for 10 months and they were like, man, we're about to ban you. And in that moment, I was like, my settler colonialism came out. I said, I'm Canadian, what do you mean? And then I was like, whoa, Shanice's gotta challenge that, right? Having a Canadian passport absolutely benefits from settler colonialism. That means that you get to travel a lot of places without a visa, right? In ways that other people can't. My birthday's in August. I was inviting my friends to a trip. And one of my friends was like, I can't come because I don't have PR status yet. And in that moment, I was like, damn, Shanice, you planned this really dope birthday and now your friends can't even come because of settler colonialism. My friend has a Bahamian passport, but they need a visa. And because they're trying to get PR status in Canada, they can't leave, right? So having that Canadian passport, citizenship, and even then, when we're talking about Canadian citizenship, I think it was between 2007 and 2015, If you had access to citizenship in another country, you could be deported, even though you were born here. Now they revoked that law, but the conservatives definitely put that in place. Prior to 2015, even though I was born here, because my dad was born in Trinidad, I could get deported. So citizenship, yes, settler colonialism, but depending on what you look like, can backfire. I saw a hand over here. Yep. 100%. When people ask, I think it's so hilarious when people ask, like, where are you from? I'm like, here. And they're like, no, where are your families from? I'm like, okay, I get it. You see that I'm part Black. Yes, they're not from here. They could be, though. They could have been here for 400 years. I could be one of those generations. They're not, but I could be. But also as an Indigenous person, you asking me where I'm from, hilarious. You're on my land. That's where I'm from. Yeah.
And after my MBA, I launched my startup, and I've been working for my startup for like 2.5 years now. Last year, I applied for my permanent residency, which got rejected because I don't have Canadian experience with someone else. I have 3 master's degrees, 10 years of experience in healthcare, and with MBA. A white person could decide whether I stay or not in this country. I had to give up my own work to like someone in my community to like pick me as an employee just to sponsor my permanent residency application or like even just a work permit. I got a couple of offers for like jobs and stuff for like $20 or $25 an hour or something like that. I was easily making 6 figures. And that's your benefit, that you could hire me literally just because your government supports you, that I have to work for you, otherwise the government would deport me. I rejected those offers. Although I have to work, so I picked one that actually supports what I believe in and truly values me. But if you are Canadian or if you hold a Canadian passport, you are deciding who you want to bring in, who you want to work with, how much you want to value them. So that's a lot of power in your hand. And if you have that power, I really, really beg you that you use that wisely.
Thank you. Absolutely, right? Settler colonialism is deciding who gets to be here and why. In a way in which I want to emphasize, they do not include Indigenous people in that decision, in that perspective. And it's not to say that Indigenous people wouldn't welcome people with open arms, because that's not, I know many communities that took in a lot of refugees, right? But the fact that we're not even included in those conversations. Yeah, I saw some hands over here. Yep, right there. What do you?
Yeah, so one of the ways I was thinking about benefiting is like English literacy in general. I feel like is like a huge benefit, especially for like if you can communicate well, whether in like interviews. And I find even for myself, like if people are able to like understand and think that you have like a good vocabulary and you're able to like speak, it carries you so much farther. Because like my parents are both immigrants from Pakistan, and like even there, like even now they like talk about how much like they taught English in schools, and like students would see you as way more educated if like you were like way better at like communicating in English. And like I find it's like funny because even like when my dad, like he has a very strong like Pakistani accent, but like he'll say English words kind of like differently, like with a thick accent, or he'll like enunciate like different letters in the words, and like people kind kind of correct him, or like he'll like get embarrassed and laugh and try to like fix it himself. Like it's so much in the mentality of like trying to kind of fit in with that. But I find like even I've benefited from that, because like writing even like for the bursary program here, and like how your writing style is, and like the way that you're able to kind of carry words, like it gets you scholarships and programs that like other people who don't have that like don't really get. So
yeah, absolutely. Benefiting from speaking English in a way that society accepts. 100%. That a lot of Indigenous people don't speak English in the way that society accepts. But also as immigrants, my dad came here from an English-speaking country and was put into ESL because of his accent. Fully speaks English, like without a doubt. Probably better than I do, if we're going to be absolutely honest, because the education system in the Caribbean is 1,000 times better than Canada. But yeah, absolutely. And we'll go here for the last one.
Ask. I was thinking about how the relative peace and prosperity and comfort that not only I, but the several generations of my family before were raised in means that even if we were to even everything out, even if, you know, everyone actually had equal rights in Canada, even if everyone did have equal access to resources and healthcare and education, that wouldn't mean that everyone would be in the same place, because that intergenerational trauma, and we're learning more about epigenetics every day, and how when someone goes through an experience of trauma, that can literally change your genetic
DNA.
code, and that's passed down through your family. And that doesn't heal because yesterday you got access to education or healthcare. That's something that now exists in your genes that you're going to keep passing on. So we can't ever fix what happened in the past. We might be able to make things better now, but that's not going to put everyone on the same footing.
Absolutely. Indigenous people have never had an opportunity to collectively heal, like to just focus on healing, right? Like even when we were like, oh, okay, this might be a moment, trauma, right? So that, absolutely. The ability to just like also just move through life, and not have to think about any of this. Wow. Couldn't imagine. So when we're talking about being in solidarity with Indigenous people, I always ask, what are you afraid of? What's stopping you? Is it fear because you feel like you don't know enough? Is it fear because you feel like you don't have a right to say anything? Right? Is it fear because you think Indigenous people are going to be angry if you ask the wrong things? Right? A lot of times people come to me and they're like, I'm afraid. When I do surveys before I do trainings, it's like, I'm afraid to ask this question in front of the group. Right? There's a fear in being in solidarity with communities. And you see this a lot. Right? This idea that you're associating with something that you don't necessarily understand. The asking for non-Indigenous folks to be outside protesting with Indigenous people, right? Are you afraid for your life? I know we are. I protested here in Ottawa and had someone try to run me over with their car. I'm afraid, right? So if I'm afraid for my life, it's fine if you're afraid for your life, but are you showing up? The issue isn't that you're afraid. The issue is that you stay in your fear. Being in solidarity with Indigenous people means stepping past your fear to show up. To say, yeah, I'm scared right now. Yeah, this seems hard. Yeah, this seems big, but I'm going to do it anyways. That's what solidarity is. It's really, all right, this is it, and I'm going to show up anyways. Because Indigenous people have to do that every single day. When we wake up in the morning, we have to remind ourselves, I might deal with racism today, or I might open up Facebook and see another missing Indigenous woman, or I might see that police have killed another person, or I might have to watch an Indigenous woman die on Facebook Live while she lays in a hospital in Quebec. Right? That's stuff we have to wake up with every morning. Or Indigenous women going to the doctors wondering, am I going to get sterilized today? Or a prime example, an Inuk woman gave birth in a hospital in Edmonton, unfortunately lost the baby, and was sent home with the wrong baby to bury. The hospital contacted her 3 months later. Those are the things that we have to deal with every day, that we have to wake up with, that we have to unpack, right? That fear. I am deathly terrified of giving birth in a hospital. Birth alerts might not exist in Ontario anymore, but it doesn't mean they're not still doing it. And if folks don't know what birth alerts are, that's when hospital staff get to call child services on you after you give birth. Yep. Those are the things that we have to deal with, right? So if we have to deal with all of that, and you're just afraid of showing up, you have to ask yourself, why is that stopping you when all of this trauma is not stopping us? So myths that non-Indigenous racialized people are told is that they owe the settler state. And I hear this a lot from non-Indigenous folks, racialized folks, refugees, migrants. They're afraid to step up and support Indigenous people on these lands because they're taught that they owe the settler state. Well, we allowed you in here. How dare you protest us? What do you mean? We gave you citizenship and you're against oppression? Right? That's the story that they tell you, that you can't stand up and fight, right? That we should be thankful for being here. And sometimes it's our own family saying this, right? They talk about where we've come from. There's also a fear in that. Some of us come from countries where protesting means the police can come in your house and kill you, right? It's absolutely terrifying. That was my grandmother's biggest fear, was me protesting. Because she was like, in Trinidad, the police kill you like it's nothing. And there will be no one marching for you. And there's evidence of that. A Trinidadian woman was protesting, Black woman was protesting, pregnant because her son had been murdered by the police not too long ago, and the police killed her. And people blamed her for being outside, right? So there's that fear, there's that very real fear. But again, Indigenous people have that fear every day, right? So when we're thinking about these myths, it's important to challenge them, to unpack them. Yes, there's that very real fear. But again, if people are doing it back home, right? If there are people taking that risk, why can't we take that risk here? And the government will scare you and threaten you into not supporting Indigenous people on these lands. They'll threaten you with things like deportation, right? And that is also very scary. And I'm not saying to go out and protest and not also think about your safety. That's not what Indigenous people are asking. But they're asking for you to show up in real and concrete ways. Again, also within your own safety. I think there's this idea when people ask you to protest that you're supposed to just like throw your bodies at the police and like be like, shoot me. No, that's not what they're asking, right? But they're asking you to show up. So as folks that are migrants or immigrants or refugees, that might look like having an immigration lawyer's number on your arm, right? When you go to protest, people might tell you in marker, write a lawyer's number on your arm. Your lawyer might be an immigration lawyer because you know what's coming, right? It means supporting Indigenous people in ways that also allow you to be safe. So how can you fight for your community's liberation in non-harmful ways? Right, when we're talking about being in solidarity with Indigenous people, and sometimes that looks like movements on these lands for ourselves and for others. Inviting elders. People were talking about right access to elders and that connection. Elders oftentimes get forgotten when we talk about solidarity with Indigenous people, past them simply doing an opening, right? And that's another thing. Stop inviting elders to do a 2-minute opening and then leaving them. It's extremely disrespectful. They are not here for show. Right? So including them to be a part of what you're doing. Indigenous solidarity looks like when you're fighting for liberation on these lands as well, that you're including Indigenous people in every single step of the way. You want to end police brutality against racialized bodies? Let's look at the RCMP too. Let's look at the history of violence the RCMP has done against Indigenous peoples and ask them about ways in which they've resisted. It means reaching out to nations whose land you're on. Are you putting them in danger sometimes by some of the protests that you're doing? If you know you're going to do a protest on a topic and you haven't let a nation near you know, or you haven't talked to them, a perfect example out in BC, there was a nation that was in mourning. Some youth had taken their lives and people still ran a protest while they were trying to do their mourning ceremonies, right? When we're thinking about liberation and fighting, it means also taking time to honor things that are happening in the communities around you. Again, it looks like seeing what's already being done. When you're thinking about being in solidarity with Indigenous people, it doesn't mean just making something up off the spot. It means talking to Indigenous people and saying, what have y'all done? How do we support that? How do we uplift that? How do we learn from it? It means buying materials and resources from Indigenous people, right? Supporting Indigenous economy. I know capitalism, I hate it too, but we live in a capitalistic society. And where would you rather your money go? Me personally, racialized and Indigenous organizations, right? It means supporting them. And again, acknowledging the communities around you in real and concrete ways past just the land acknowledgement. So solidarity can look like many different things, right? Actions are dependent on the community that you're wishing to support. What works for the Algonquin people here in Ottawa might not work for Inuit in Nunavut. It might not even work for Inuit in Ottawa, right? It's really about speaking to the community and asking them how they would like you to support them. My favorite thing always to do is like shut up and show up. I show up, I say, what do you need? And then I shut up and I do it. Because it's not my role to tell you how to organize your space. It's not our roles to tell Indigenous people how to organize their spaces. There were some protests in Ottawa in 2020, and there was a lot of white people telling folks how to organize. And this wasn't about y'all, this was about Indigenous people. So if you feel this urge to tell Indigenous people how to do what they're doing, stop it. Write it down in your diary. My friend always says, give it to your diary, God, or your mother. Send it there, right? But there are some key things that you can do. So one is looking at your positionality. In the beginning, remember I talked about who I was, what this means to me, right? You have to start with unpacking your positionality. So how have you and your family come to these lands? Whether it was 6 generations ago, or maybe it's you, think about it. If your family's been here for 6 generations, how did they get here? What does it mean? Right? A lot of Irish folks like to be like, we came here during the famine and we were starving and that's why we needed land. That doesn't mean that you weren't settlers. You might have been oppressed in Ireland. You weren't here, right? So how did you get here? Again, whose land are you on? What are the traditional names for themselves and the territories? You had shared about being around Montreal, the Iroquois Confederation. Prime example, Haudenosaunee is the correct term, right? It's learning those names, and a lot of folks don't know that. My favorite thing is when people are doing land acknowledgements in Toronto, and they're like, we'd like to acknowledge the Anishinaabe and the Mississauga. The Mississauga are Anishinaabe. It's learning that. It's learning that they are, that is them, right? It's past just simply saying names to say names. Now, if you wanted to say the Anishinaabe and the Mississauga, it would be important to name all of the Anishinaabe nations. There's 7, right? It's important to be intentional about who you're speaking about, right? In the same way when Black folks are like, don't call us people of color, we're Black. It's in the same way Indigenous people call them by their nation's names. Ask yourself, what privileges do you have? Because we all have them, every single one of us. Access to post-secondary, privilege. Speak English, privilege. Live in an urban setting, privilege, right? What you look like, privilege. I'm a light-skinned person. I know how I navigate spaces, especially Black spaces, gives me a lot of privilege, right? You have to unpack that. What does it mean to move through those spaces? And then the number one is, what are you willing to give up? I hate when people are like, equity isn't about giving something up. No, it is. It absolutely is. It's about giving up your privilege. Sometimes it's about giving up power. Sometimes it's about giving up positions. What are you willing to give up to actually be in solidarity with Indigenous people? And that's something you have to ask yourself. If you're not willing to give up anything, then you're not willing to be in solidarity with Indigenous people, because you're going to have to do it at some point. Maybe it's giving up your biases, your internalized racism, your internalized anti-indigeneity, right? These are all things that you have to give up. Next is education. You need to educate yourself. So watch movies and documentaries on the history of Indigenous peoples, and I've listed some here. Now, some talk a bit about the US. The Real Engine, The Canary Effect are 2 films that talk a bit about Canada, but also talk about the US, because it's important to learn, again, about that history of both. We've already talked about borders cutting across nations. It means reading books, right? In Search of April Raintree is the book that I read when I was 18 years old that pushed me to do the work that I do today. Watch TED-Eds. I love TED-Eds. Watch them, learn from them, hear from Indigenous people. Talk to actual Indigenous people. We're not scary. We're not gonna bite. You can talk to us. Always ask first if they have the capacity though. I hate when people just slide in my DMs and don't ask me, hey, are you in a space to talk about this right now? Also make sure that you're asking them questions that are relevant to their nation. I had someone ask me about Navajo spirits. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm gonna have to Google it too. Like I'm not Navajo. I'm not even close. Navajo, that's in Arizona, y'all. But make sure you're asking nations what's relevant to their nations and also compensate them. Now, this might not always look like money. Sometimes that nation might be like, I need you to show up. I need you to cook. I need you to bring food. I need you to buy materials. I need you to just come sit in our nation and spend time with us, but compensate them, right? Indigenous people aren't here just to serve folks. We have to educate ourselves on our own history and y'all, it's tiring, right? Compensate us. And then show up. So look for actions taking place in your area, donate to Indigenous causes and communities. Don't speak for or over Indigenous peoples when you do show up. I made that point, right? Educate others. And that doesn't always necessarily mean, again, speaking for Indigenous people. Educating others means sending an article or a TED-Ed or a movie. And also create an action plan. How do you want to be in solidarity with Indigenous people? What does that look like for you, right? So that brings me to the end of my presentation, right on time. Look at that. Brings me to the end of my presentation. But if folks have any questions, I don't know if we have time for questions right now. We might not because we're right at the 2 hours. But this is my email address, my website, my Instagram. Feel free to message me. Might take me some time to get back to you if you message me on Instagram. But message me if you have any questions about this presentation, if you want to learn more, right? I'm always down to have conversations when I have the capacity. But I just want to say, Chimigwich, merci, and thank you to all of you for being in this space with me here today and learning. And also thank you for being extremely vulnerable in this space. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Chimigwich.